Well, this evening in our chronological study of the Bible, we're looking at, again, the life of Abraham, one of the patriarchs. Maybe call him the patriarch of the Bible. He was a man where God, of course, used to be the founder of the nation of Israel. And so far in our study, we found out where he came from and his calling, and some of his things he's learning in his faith, his failures. Last week we saw him as sort of a rescuer, a hero. His nephew Lot was moved to the city of Sodom, and they were taken over by another group of kings, and he was captured. As we saw in the Bible there, Abraham took a group of 300 and some men and went down and as a soldier. He's very talented, isn't he? He's a soldier, he's a shepherd, he's a man of wealth. He could do all these things, and he went and rescued Lot. And tonight we're going to pick up from the story after he rescued Lot, and he meets a very unusual character of the Bible, and he becomes a very prominent character in our scriptures. So if we want to look at Genesis chapter 14 there, you can turn there or look up on the screen. And it says, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of, now here's one of the hard names, Shedar or Lamur. And I probably have never got that name right. And the kings that were with him at the valley of Shavah, which is the king's dale. Okay, so he comes back, he rescues, and there's a meeting comes up, and now verse 18 is this character we talked about, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God, and he blessed him, and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand, and he gave him tithes of all. Now, as he returns back, he comes across this man by the name of Melchizedek, and he's called a priest. He's called the king of Salem. Now, who is this Melchizedek? There's always a lot of, theories of this man. We're going to look. He was a person who, in the New Testament, Christ is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so, well, let me just go to that passage in Hebrews. I can just get that quick. We studied that in the Hebrews passage. Because for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom he also, Abraham, gave a tenth part of all, being interpreted king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Now consider how great Abraham, this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. And we learn also in the Hebrews 7 where Christ didn't become a priest after the order of Melchizedek and not after the Aaronic priesthood. Okay, that's a lot of information there about that. But who is this Melchizedek? And there's always theories about him, because Hebrews says he doesn't have the beginning of days or end of days, and doesn't have father or mother. And some people say, was he an eternal being, or is it just no records of that? And here is some of the theories of that. And one is there's some who thought he could be Shem. You want to know something, but the problem is with that, Shem would have been already dead. Or, Shem had passed away by that time, so that probably not. But some people say, well, it could have been Shem, this righteous son of Noah. And then some who believe it could have been Christ himself in one of these the theophanies, the Christophany. Okay, and some people do that because of the wording in Hebrews that he has without father or mother, without beginning of days, without end of days. Some people say, well, maybe he's talking about Christ upon earth, like he did at times there as a Christophany. So some people think that. And there's others who believe he's basically this the king of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is not mentioned here, but the word Salem is, and most people believe that Salem was the older name for Jerusalem. Salam is in the word Jerusalem, and so that's what some of them believe. Maybe some have. I did. I'm sure, Joseph, you had some papers to write on Melchizedek, and everybody in college goes studying for the ministry do. So, what was your? Did you have any studies that you thought?
Personally, I just thought he was a king that just happened to be at that time, that he was also a priest and a king. But like you said, that he had no beginning, he had no end, and that the writer of Hebrews just said, like Melchizedek, Christ is the same way.
Mm-hmm. And so he was this priest, this man of God, this king at this time, that who somewhere along the line, Genesis brings Abraham and Melchizedek together. That's probably what I would probably come down on the side of, is he was probably not a theophany, probably not a Christophany, just probably a godly person there that Abraham had come across, who was a type of Christ. Remember, in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, there's these types. They weren't actually Christ, but they were types. And there's a lot of characters in the Bible are referred to as types of Christ. And Melchizedek was that type of person. And so that's another thing there, that people, before the law was written, before God gave any written word, there were people following the Lord as God had revealed himself through different means, that they understood God. They understood the basics of the eternal one, as we know, the Yahweh, the Jehovah of the Bible. Now, it's also noticed at this time that there were some things that went on here. We'll look at what he brought him. He brought him bread and wine. A lot of first in the scripture. This is the first mention of bread and wine in the Bible. This thing here of, and some people even think this is a depiction of the work of Christ. Because this morning in our, we took the bread and juice. What was that? What was that a picture of Christ? Well, that's what Jesus, when he with his disciples broke the bread and drank of the wine. It was said, this is the body, this is the blood. And so here, even way back here, maybe this was even a picture of that to come in this thing here. You can make too much of it, but that's a possibility of this, the significance of why he brought these things. This is actually the first occurrence of the word priest in the Bible. The New Testament, Genesis, has a lot of firsts, okay? So this is the first time we see a priest mentioned in the Bible. And in fact, let me just give you this little sidebar here in our study notes. If you got that book, the book, there's 3 great offices in the Old Testament. There's a little sidebar there. And there's 3 offices throughout in the Old Testament. We're going to see the prophet. It was one who represented God to man. Okay, the prophet brought the voice of God to man. Then there was the priest. That was one who represented man to God. He represented man to God. And then there was the king, and one who, under God, ruled over man. Okay, in the Old Testament, so you see the prophet, you see the priest, you see the king. And you see these developed in the Old Testament scriptures. This is the first mention of the priest. Later on, we'd see the mention of the prophets. And then later on, under Saul and David, we see the kings. In the New Testament, all 3 of these can be seen in Christ. And Christ, he was a prophet. He talked to man from God. He was a priest in his ministry of representing man to God. And he will be a king, and that rules and reigns in the future. So Jesus is the prophet, the priest, and the king. But here we see this man of Melchizedek, this character of the Bible that's so significant that Hebrews picks him up as somebody who Christ is after the order of. Also, the significant thing on this is that we see the giving of tithes in here. And Abraham gave tithes to him. So Abraham looked at this man as a representative of God. And you give tithes to somebody higher than you. Tithes go to God. And so he felt this man was giving to the work of God, giving to God. Now, anything interesting about tithes here. Now, there was no command yet for tithing, was there? Were there? So we understand that because some folks would say, well, tithing was just something under the Mosaic law. Well, tithes predate the Mosaic law. It goes back before the law. This is a number of years before the law. So before the law was written to Israel and the words that we have, and it outlined the tithe system for the nation of Israel it later on. But here, there were no laws written yet. The nation was not formally organized yet. And Abraham felt here that it was giving to God, and that was his offering. And the tithe is, now, what did he take the tithe of? He took the tithes of the spoils and things that he had got from war there, but still he believed that, it belonged to the Lord. It wasn't his. Of all of his possessions, God deserved the first part. And so, it's not. So in the New Testament, our giving is based upon our everything. It belongs to God, and we give to Him freely. Tithe has always been the baseline of giving. Before the law, during the law, and after the law. In the New Testament, you're not bound by the tithe. You don't have to only give 10%. God says you grow in that grace. It's a growing experience. So many folks who has a growing experience for Christ will find out that God increases that desire to give more. And as God gives you that desire to give more to God, God then sees fit for His blessings to bring more back into you in order to get back out. So it's giving to God, and it's the baseline, but not the bottom line. It's not the end thing. It's just the beginning of our giving, and it's just sort of been a system in place that everybody knew, and God put it in the hearts of people. And but our giving is not only our tithe; it's the giving of our talents, our time, and everything that we have is to give to God. Now, this is one more last thing about in chapter 14 about this old king of Solomon here. After that, the king of Sodom said unto Abram, "Give me the persons and take the goods to thyself." So basically, Abraham was the guy who won everything, and king of Sodom comes here and he wants to work out a deal and take what he wants. And Abraham gives us some principles. You don't deal with unrighteous people like this. Because Abraham delivered this group, it didn't mean he approved of Sodom. He went there because of his nephew Lot. He knew that the people of Sodom were wicked people. So he didn't deal with them. And Abraham said to the king of Sodom, "I lift up mine hand to the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldst say, I have made Abram rich." He says, "I'm not going to take anything. You can have your stuff." He says, "I don't want you to say one day I'm indebted to you because I took your stuff." And he knew that this king of Sodom was an unrighteous character. And the Bible warns us about not making agreements and contracts and covenants with unrighteous people. And when you do, you've always come back to get you. Abram was a very smart man. Here's another man who understood that. And so he said, "The only thing I want is what I needed for the supplies for my people during the war." And he said there's things that they had to take to eat and to survive during the war. He said, "That's all I want. You can have your stuff. You get my nephew back home and take your stuff, and we'll go back to our place." So he did not make an agreement with Sodom, the king of Sodom there. Now, that's an interesting chapter of the Bible, and it has a lot in there about the war, about the deliverance, about Melchizedek, some principles in there. So there's a lot in chapter 14. Let's go to chapter 15, because this is a very important chapter of the Bible. It has to do with really the ratification of this Abrahamic covenant, which is the key covenant of the Bible. And the first thing we want to see in verse 1, that God comes back to Abram and said, and after these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, "Fear not, Abram, I am a shield in thy exceeding great reward. He says, Abraham, don't be afraid of what could happen, because there could be a lot of dangerous times. When you win a war, you also make a lot of enemies too. So, those maybe some of the things that Abraham said, now I'm going to have to fight every time I turn around. These kings that I beat, they're going to regroup and come back and get me. God says, no, I'll take care of you. I'll take care of you. I'm your shield. I'm your defense system. Okay? I'm the 24-hour, 7 days a week defense system for you, Abraham. And you just follow me and you'll be just fine. So Abraham gets that assurance from God. But then he begins to talk to God, says, about this promise and about this future thing that he was told about, that he would become a father of a nation. So in verse 2, and Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And basically he says, I'm still getting old, I don't have any descendants, and I've got this one good guy here, he's one of my servant's sons, I'll adopt him and let him, he can be the heir. Maybe that's what you want. And God said, no, that's not the one. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, Thou shalt not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thy bowels, out of you and Sarah. He said, that's going to be the seed. And of course, this was a tough, we don't want to get too hard on Abram. This was a tough thing to understand. I mean, there's this guy, pushing 90 years old by this time or more, and he said, you're going to have a family? He said, Lord, it's a little bit late for a family. And, this was not something that you've seen done on a regular basis. This wasn't so, you can look at this. No, you didn't have anything to look at. The only thing he had to do, he had to believe God. Now, he's going to believe God, but still it's tough. And so this time he tries this way. Now, chapter 16, we see where he makes even a worse mistake. But, he's just trying to say, well, God, maybe this is it. And God says, no, you're going to have your own son. And so he gives this promise. And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said to them, So shalt thy seed be. He says, basically, he says, your people's going to be innumerable someday. It's not necessarily a specific number, like, okay, for every star, there's probably one child of Israel. He's just talking, you can't number the stars. You can't number them. And in fact, it's interesting, I was reading that the people of ancient times, they only thought there was about 1,200 stars. We now know that because of all the galaxies and all of the different things around them, where he says the stars should be as the sand, the sea, they said it could be quite possible there's as many stars as there is sand. I mean, it's just stars are just innumerable in the universe. Why? Because there's no end to the universe. So it's something that, it just blows our mind when we think about it, doesn't it? But he says, Abraham, don't worry. He says, you're going to have an innumerable amount of people. And here we are 4,000 years later, and you can't count all the people whose Jewish descent. I mean, they're scattered all over the world, and they've been in existence for 4,000 years, and, they're just everywhere. Because why? That's what God promised Abraham would happen. Now, this is the next point of this is very interesting. And verse 15 is a very key verse of the Bible. And he says, and he believed in the Lord. Or basically, the best way is that he believed God. He just believed the Lord. And God counted unto him for righteousness. Now this is a basis here that becomes the basis for justification by faith. Paul himself used this verse back in Romans as he taught the people in the New Testament times, people like us, that you're justified by faith and not by works. And so in Romans chapter 4, he uses this verse for a key verse to teach justification by faith. Now, there's some key words in this passages, and the first word is the word believed, and he had faith, okay? And it doesn't say that he did not say Abraham pleased God or appeased God. He said he believed God. Okay? He believed. Faith is believing what God has said. And then the word counted. In the New Testament is more the idea of the imputation. It's imputed. He believed the Lord and he counted it. He imputed him with righteousness. You know, the doctrine of imputation, later on in theological studies, when we study the doctrine of salvation, these are one of the things you study. He put his righteousness to our account. That's in the righteousness of Christ to our account. When we believed in salvation, God imputed, basically God imputed our sin to Christ and Christ's righteousness to us. So here's the first mention of that imputation. Abraham was saved not because he was a sinless character, because he wasn't sinless. He had problems, he had difficulties, ups and downs like we do. But he was saved because he was justified by his faith. And he counted to him for righteousness. Righteousness. The idea of a righteousness is the idea, the right clothing. It was the clothing that God provided for him in spiritual clothing. The Bible teaches that without Christ we're basically unclothed with righteousness. We just have our own, which is unclothed. When Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, that was their first understanding that they weren't clothed. And then they tried to make their own clothes. And that's man trying to fit his clothing. There's always pictured man trying to fit his clothing to be right with God. And then God made a set of clothes that pictured that only God can provide the right clothing for your salvation. So in our picture here we see God here telling Abraham, you believed and now you're clothed with my righteousness. Not your righteousness, my righteousness. And we're saved and right with God not because of my righteousness or your righteousness, but because of the righteousness of Christ. And that's His grace, and that's what God does at salvation. But that's a very important verse because it's the first talking of that, and that becomes a very central part of salvation teaching in the Bible. He believed, it was imputed of righteousness, and righteousness is the right clothing that God provides for our salvation. Now, an interesting section of the Bible here now is this covenant ratified. And God once again said, I'm the Lord God that brought thee out of Ur of Chaldees. And he said, Abraham says, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? Now here's the question. He said, God, how shall I know that can be counted on? How do I know that you're going to give me this land? How can I know that these promises are true? And as someone wrote words, this is a very strange reply. God says, Abraham says, how can I know? And God says, give me a heifer. Take me a heifer. God doesn't always answer our questions exactly the way we think they should be answered. God was going to show him in a picture way of how this covenant would be unconditionally met. In the Bible, or one of the ways that in our society, the way we do when two come together, if we want to make sure something is done, we form a contract, don't we? And the way we do it, we will get a lawyer to draw up some papers and has all the ins and outs and what all the boundaries and what all that stuff. And then the two parties agree on that and they sign their names. And that's a binding contract. Now, we do know in our world today, binding contracts are not always that binding, but it's supposed to be binding. But in the Old Testament, there was a covenant made, and a covenant was made in different ways. And God told him to take this heifer. He would take a she-goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. Okay, you go out there and get these things. And these became basically the types of animals that normally was used as sacrifices in the Old Testament. And he basically took a sampling of all these different sacrifices. And then, as we summarize this chapter here, God said that I want you to split these animals in two, except for the birds. They don't split them in two. And he said, you split these animals in two. And this was not an unusual thing for God in the Old Testament times. If a contract or a covenant would be, if two people was wanting their contract, their agreement to stay together, they would make this blood covenant. And they would take these animals and they would separate them. Bloody animals that was butchered, and one half over here and one half over here. And they would walk together between those two halves of these animals, signifying that this covenant will stay intact, by the blood of this covenant. And, one of them breaks his covenant, so shall it be done unto you, basically. It was a very binding, serious thing of the walk between these two. And so this is what he did, and he got the pieces together. And then there's something that came up here. He put a sleepness up on Abraham. So Abraham sort of went off into a sleep. And in the same day, in verse 17, and we'll come back to some things that he told him in a minute, but he come back, and when the sun went down, at sunset, it was dark, God sort of presented himself in an unusual way as a smoking furnace and a burning lamp. So basically a lamp-looking thing passed between those pieces. Now, God did not take Abraham with him through the pieces. Now, what's the significance of that?
Basically that no matter what Abraham did, no matter what his people did, God would still honor the contract. Basically, this is a one-person motivation.
Abraham was not going to be, it wasn't going to be up to him to break it or not. God says, I'm going to assure you on who I am as God, that this covenant is not going to be broken. And that's the reason we call it an unconditional covenant. This covenant was ratified by God based on no conditions. Now, there's other covenants that are conditional. The Mosaic covenant was a conditional covenant that God made with Moses about blessings. And the blessings was based upon obedience, and there never was obedience, so they didn't get all the blessings. But the unconditional covenant of the nation was always intact and still intact. So that's the reason I believe that Israel still is in God's plan in the future because of God's covenant here. We've talked about that a lot, and that'll be something in the future too. We talk about the church is not Israel. We're not the new Israel. I think God is going to bring back all these promises He's told us in the Old Testament and all these promises He made to Abraham. God's not going to go back upon His word. And so He made this promise, He made this covenant, this unconditional covenant, walked not with Abraham. He didn't even let Abraham get in, because if Abraham would have walked in with him, and Abraham would have backed out somehow, or went off the deep end, or got into sin, and went back to Ur, the covenant then would have had, the picture would have been broken. And God says, let me go through there. In verses 13 to 16, actually before he walked through, there was a number of things he told Abraham that would take place. I just want to list those things. And these are some prophecies that God brought. Now this is here, it would happen. Number one, Abraham's descendants would be as strangers in a foreign land. Okay, now he's talking about eventually they would be taken into Egypt. Number two, they would be servants in that land as slaves. Now these are all in these verses 13 to 16. They would last 400 years. We see this later on in the book of Genesis and Exodus. God Himself would later judge that nation enslaved Israel. Abraham himself would be spared of all of this. And after spending 4 generations in Egypt, Israel would return to Canaan, which they did. And Israel would come out of Egypt with great substance. And so, these are some prophecies about the future of the nation of Israel from Abraham's time. Now we see these all fulfilled later on in the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. And so God in His covenant says these are the things that's going to happen, but you can be assured, Abraham, that every promise that I've made to you about your seed, your descendants, your land, and that's the key there with the land, I will guarantee it by my faithfulness, by my truthfulness, as we've been seeing the attributes of God, by my immutability, these attributes that we've been looking at in our theology, by all of these things of who I am, they will go forth. So Abraham had a real, concrete, visible promise and picture that everything that God told him would be fulfilled. A great chapter of the Bible that talks about the unconditional with a ratification of this covenant. God first announced it. God told him more about it, but here he ratified it, saying it's sealed. It's done. So chapter 15 is some very important things. Justification by faith has the foundation of this chapter, and the unconditional Abrahamic covenant is based upon this chapter of the Bible by the sacrifice here of God going through in the lambs. Great chapter of the Bible. Hope we enjoyed that, and hope it brings us a good foundation of God and His truthfulness. For some reason I can't get it.